And he's a great interviewer. He feels good today. He's ready for action. It's good. So we'll just jump right into it. Thanks.
Hey. This is a real treat for me. One of the Jeff is really nice. He lets me hang out with the committee that invites cartoonists here, and so I always have the pleasure every year of getting to talk to one of my favorite cartoonists. And I've been following your work since I first read Tales of Woodsman Pete back in 2006. And I fell madly in love with it, and I said, I'm going to be following this work forever, but I've never had a chance to talk with you or hear you speak, so I'm really excited for a chance to do so now. And I have to admit, it was only about a year ago when we first met and started talking about bringing you out here for this that I realized, holy cow, you do a lot of other things too. In addition to being a very prolific cartoonist, you work, as Jeff was saying, in book arts and sculpture and animation, just to name a few. And at this very moment, Lilli has a major exhibit on in Chicago as well, which she has to get back for in a couple of days, that doesn't even focus around your comics art. So this is somebody who does a lot of things. So part of what I wanted to ask you is really about kind of your training, about as somebody who works in so many different media and so many different forms, and not always forms that people think come together. I think the organic connections between animation and comics makes some intuitive sense to people, but sculpture and comics maybe less so. Mm-hmm. Could you just tell a little bit about your early training as an art student and kind of how you got started?
Okay. Well, I think the earliest training was really just having two graphic designer parents. With like old graphic design tools. Yeah, they'll really mess you up. All this paper was around. They just really encouraged drawing. It was kind of how they, let my sister and I amuse ourselves growing up. So drawing was just kind of a natural thing for me. And so then
you grew up in California, right?
Yeah.
In the LA area?
In LA.
Right, yeah.
My last year of high school, I went to an arts high school. And so that kind of got me thinking that, well, I'm going to go to college for this, and I want to keep doing this, keep taking different classes, trying out different materials and stuff like that. And so when I decided to go to the Art Institute of Chicago, I had just seen a documentary on John Cage, and I was like, oh, okay, forget drawing. I'm all about sound and John Cage silence and like all these different approaches to creativity, and he just really spoke to me. And so I went to Chicago, and they have a very good sound program there. But what I also liked about it is that there was no major that you have to set yourself into. You can really just branch out.
So you didn't have to pick a track.
Right. I was like, well, I'll be a sound artist, but if I want, I can draw. But pretty quickly, I got back into drawing and started taking the animation classes and fiber classes, writing, everything.
That's great. And they had creative writing classes there as well? Oh, that's terrific. So part of it is just, in addition to having parents who encouraged you to just try everything and use the paper and materials that were around your house, being in a program that did not assume that people who were doing visual arts shouldn't be taking creative writing classes, and you were able to really try them all. And then, we reach a point where a lot of people think, okay, I got to pick one, and that's got to be my main focus. And you didn't. Right. You've
for better or worse?
No, clearly for better. But I mean, does working across these different media continue to inform your work in these different media?
Yeah, I mean, I just can't help it. I think I could develop my voice in comics or in any particular form probably, or I could probably make a stronger voice in one if I just stuck to it, but I just think my instinct to make stuff really can't help but branch out. And I think about, how comics relate to animation. When I get sick of working on a comic, it's really exciting to then get to think about animation, how I can draw so fluidly. There's not so much pressure on each drawing. So I can just really go at it. It's still drawing, it's still storytelling, still thinking about time, but in a completely different way.
And the frame works differently in animation as well. I mean, I notice a lot of your animation. This is a beautiful little short experimental, what do you call these? Actually, you have a nice name for these moving drawings, I think is your category on your website. But yeah, I mean, they're the wonderful animated GIFs taken to terrific heights. And so part of is you describe the animation giving you more kind of space, more fluidity than you find within the comics panel?
I think they're different. I think that it's just like if I've worked on comics for a while, or any of these media for a while.
You need to move. You just need to.
It's refreshing to then think about maybe the same ideas or the same motivations of, if I'm thinking about storytelling in a comic, then I think about, well, how can I translate this sort of general concept to animation, to the like formal properties of animation? So I have, Woodsman Pete's this character who's like retelling his history over and over, and it's straying, and thinking about time in this grid and kind of showing a year of his life in one page, something like that. But when I think about storytelling and animation, you also have this element of like redrawing everything over and over, and it just naturally wants to stray. And so there's this kind of formal connection there that I think is sort of interesting, and then I can take that and run with it.
And you have a theme that runs through a lot of your works, obviously of dreams, that we'll talk about that, but also of bodies transforming. You have a lot of heads popping off too. I've noticed.
I'm glad you noticed that.
I love heads popping off. So and we'll look at some popping off heads before we're done, I'm sure. But here's a bunch of them actually just spinning around. And the loop. I mean, just by here's an example of the loop is a different way of experiencing bodies in time than the comics panel as well. Well, if you don't mind, I just want to kind of pull you back to the beginning of your career in publishing, back to those heady days of 2006. As I mentioned, this Tales of Woodsman Pete was my first experience of your work. I'm going to jump ahead here just to a page of. We'll come back to some of this other stuff. And I was reminded when I was looking at some of your slides that this began as was it a self-published mini comic that you did?
Yeah.
And were you doing that in Chicago when you were you still a student then when you were working on that, or?
Yeah. So I grew up reading comics and liking them a lot. Should I talk about that?
Yeah. Who'd you read? I always resist that question because it's like the geeky interviewer comics.
I think it's really interesting
to
find out what people looked at.
Honestly, the last two people I did this, they rolled their eyes when I asked that question.
Really?
So, yeah.
Well, I'm right here.
Thank you. Don't tell
I
them.
brought it up.
All right.
I think the first comic I truly fell in love with was Mad magazine. And it's not even like I really understood a lot of the stories. This is when I was like 10 or 11 or something. But like the covers themselves, and I think like them as physical objects that were funny. I could tell they were funny. Some things were more like understandable. Like I got Spy versus Spy. I got some of the stuff, some of the like spoofs. I had no idea what they were talking about. But
there are tons of movies I know only through the parodies that I read when I was 10 years old.
Yeah, like Coma I've never seen, but I really distinctly remember that.
You remember
issue.
that parody, right?
Yeah, and the cover, like that one in particular. Yeah. So yeah, I know all these movies through these mad parodies of them. But
and then the fold-in, of course.
Oh, that was that's the magic part. But I just got really into going to Heidi Ho, which was a comic store nearby, and trying to find the earliest ones I could find, and looking at the covers, just spending a lot of time with this like one particular box of old mags. It wasn't the new ones either. It was just like this weird obsession with getting the earliest comic I could.
That's great. So you had that archival desire that comics fans tend to get.
But only with Mad.
Oh, no,
at that era, I was just like really set on it.
You can't do much better. And so, I mean, but there is an element throughout all your work of humor, albeit often a kind of dark humor. Woodsman Pete, if you haven't read Woodsman's Pete, his best friend is a stuffed dead bear.
His rug.
His rug. It's also his rug. And he has extended conversations with various decapitated heads on his wall.
Oh, I never connected
Yeah,
those.
I'm saying there are a lot of heads there. This is what I do. Including one who has a heartbreaking moment of revelation. And there's definitely humor there. And a lot of the other, later stuff, the humor is lighter and dreamier. But I can see the influence of Mad even in that early work. What did you read after your Mad period?
Well, that
Not that
kept
one
going.
ever outgrows Mad. I
Yeah,
still
right.
subscribe to Mad at age 50 billion or whatever.
Then I found Bone in the same comic shop, and that I was really excited about because I could find issue number 1.
Right.
And I was so excited. And I just loved the way the world was being created, especially in the earliest part of that whole story. It was so I just had never read a story quite like that, and the characters were drawn so well.
So you got to see it actually as it was coming out in the original single issues.
Yeah, I mean, there were other ones too, but just
Right.
the fact that I could find
You
one
could
and
find
I forget how many were out at that
Yeah.
time, but then I could keep up with it, and it wasn't finished.
Yeah.
And there was one story that was really.
Whereas with Mad, there's
Exciting.
always a sense that it goes back to the 50s, and but so
Well, the
this
ones
was
I
something
was
of
looking
your
at, yeah.
this is something of your time and generation, and that was also Jeff Smith, who's obviously from Columbus, as most of you guys know, is one of the figures who was a big part of the self-publishing movement as well, along with Dave Sims before him and Terry Moore and the Pennies and so on. I imagine that would be, also kind of exciting. Although you probably, when you first started reading it, didn't know that he was
Not at all,
self-publishing,
no.
but just in terms of realizing you could get your own work out there, that there were ways to do that.
Yeah, and actually going to Chicago is when that really sunk in, because I hadn't really seen, at Heidi Ho, there weren't a lot of those kind of pamphlet books, or you
Right.
couldn't tell a person had physically made stuff
Right.
and Xerox their stuff, that kind of self-publishing. And in Chicago, there was Quimby's bookstore,
Right.
which is just loaded with that stuff. And the fact that you could just sit down with a piece of paper, put your thoughts on them, draw it, and then Xerox it, staple it, and then it would just disappear and people would have it. And that blew my mind, and it just seemed like such a direct communication to other people. And going to art school, there's the galleries, there's all these other things, but the fact that you could just do it in a day and it could be in someone's hands as this object that they own, that was just a totally new concept.
And Quimby's is a unique space in that it really does privilege kind of mini comics and self-made comics, and has a real community of people that seek them out on a regular basis.
Mm-hmm.
At least that's been my sense from visiting it a couple of times.
Yeah.
Was there a kind of divide being, I know it sounds like the Art Institute was in many ways a great place, but a lot of art students describe that moment where they're told, okay, it's time to put away comics. Those are childhood things. Now it's time to kind of move on. Was there a sense that in art school that you had to leave comics and graphic storytelling behind for other things, or was it encouraged?
Yeah, no, not at all. I think
That's
it
great.
was, in my experience might be different than others, but I wasn't really making comics and presenting them as my work so much. I was printing them in the offset class, which I took, I think, 4 or 5 times. So I was making
Mostly
them.
so you could get access to the offset printer, probably.
Yeah, so I could just print them and do covers
Right.
and make lots of copies. But people were generally, into comics.
That's
I
great.
think,
It's
I
it
can't
was a
speak
good
to
city
other
for it.
cities, but Chris Ware was in the weekly paper,
Right.
like a full-page thing. It was around.
It was
and,
the right place to be, yeah.
And I don't know, I think that Chicago is also very open-minded about figurative work and kind of narrative work, and you have the Chicago Imagists
Right.
who are from there, and they teach at the school. And so I think it depends what department you're kind of working in, but for me, I felt like I could do comics. I could do them sometimes in my creative writing classes. I could, bring them into other things, but then also it wasn't all I was doing. I was doing animation
Right.
and, fiber stuff. And,
Yeah, because one of the things, and it just was really brought home to me recently. We were in a class we were talking about David Mazzucchelli's Asterios Polyp, where on one level at least we kind of realized the book was a kind of meditation about all the different kinds of creative practices that go into making comics: architecture, sculpture, and painting, and drama, and choreography. And I hadn't really ever thought about comics themselves. Of course, they use words and images. Of course, many different talents are required. But the idea of comics themselves as a place where different art practices and trainings can and should converge is something I'd never thought about. And then thinking about your work, I was like, oh, it makes sense, right? There's somebody who's kind of doing that. And you were, I mean, at the right institute in the right city to do it. And we were talking before we began that you also had, you said you were interning for Paul Hortschemeyer at 19 when you were a student there, is that right?
Yeah.
What was he working on at the time?
I think it was the Mother Come Home.
Mother Come Home, right.
book.
So,
And he was only 26. I mean, he's
Yeah,
kind
no.
of a baby.
yeah.
But I was a very little baby. But yeah, I mean, the school kind of paired me up with him
Oh,
too.
that's
I think
great.
he had approached them
So
looking
you-
for interns,
and
and I was looking to learn about comics. And so that was really interesting to just see this person who was living off of doing, coloring and illustration and comic
Right.
stuff. And he was also distributing the Holy Consumption
Right.
comics, so Anders Nilsson, Jeffrey
Yeah.
Brown, John Hankiewicz, and himself. So I just got to be immersed in that and read all those comics and really just see how this could be approached.
And different approaches. Different approaches to distributing and collaborating. Yeah, I mean, I was going to ask you what made somebody from LA want to move to Chicago, but we're glad you did.
I didn't really, I was really just thinking sound art and, getting money to go to the school.
Yeah, no, it's great.
That's kind of what decided, was just like scholarship money and John Cage.
So how?
But I didn't realize it was such a comic city, or that there was amazing animators there, or that all these things. I guess you can't really tell. Like maybe I just
No.
grew into it. But
Although it helps to be in a place that has long winters. Cartoonists
for
flourish in
comics,
places.
I've thought a lot about this.
Yeah,
Yeah, these like pockets of where cartoonists
there's
kind of
not a
thrive.
big LA scene. You notice that? It's just.
Well, LA's so spread out. I don't really know much about.
It's also too sunny.
Scene there,
It's
but
just.
You don't feel it,
No.
and you don't hole up and have to work because you can't
Exactly.
go outside.
You need those dark spaces. So you were working on Tales of Woodsman Pete and doing it kind of self-published zines, and you ended up. This was your first book. And this was with Top Shelf, which is out of Georgia. How did that come about?
I had been sending them stuff, some of my mini comics, and it's hard. It's been a while. Just kind of corresponding with them and sending them stuff as I made it, and it kind of built up a dialogue about work I was doing, and then they.
Yeah, that was. I mean, I remember because this was, I think, the first year I started reviewing regularly, and this was one of the highlights for me of that period of because it was my first time of getting used to trying to read everything, and when you're reading everything, you get full of periods of elation and periods of despair, and this was one of my periods of hope for the future of comics. It was a wonderful work, and one of the things that I really loved about it, in addition to and it's probably not going to be very visible back there, guys. I apologize, but there's the crying head. You can see him there. Oh, that's right. You can see the little disembodied head. But it basically tells a story of most of it is a series of short stories. So the longest, I think, is maybe probably the Paul Bunyan ones are the longest. But a lot of them are just 1 page or 2 pages. Woodsman Pete mostly likes to kill animals and talk to them, and lives alone and trims his beard. There's I think I have. Yes, here's you can see him with his beard collection. He trims it every 10 years and hangs it up. And you have an interest in these ritualized routines as well, I liked in your work. And it's done very nicely orchestrated panels, a style. I really liked your style. I was like, oh, I'm going to see how that style changes. And then one of the things I noticed right away when I was following some of your short stories in Mome and other places is that I said, holy cow, this style is not her only style. Your work changes visually a lot from story to story. Mm-hmm. You kind of see this a lot this is Lilli's collection of short stories. This covers about 5 years of short stories, I think. That Fantagraphics published in 2012. And you can see, just flipping through some images here, visually the style changes a lot from story to story. And it can be, just simple pen and ink. It can be big, flat compositional color, single panel pages. And that was after Woodsman Pete, I was kind of thought, okay, I know that, you fool yourself into thinking, I know the style, I'm going to watch how this style evolves. And I suddenly realized, oh my gosh, she has a huge range of styles that she can choose from. So one of the questions I was curious about is, how do you figure out what's the right visual style, the visual tone for a particular story?
Yeah, I mean, I think this connects back to my need to just work, branch out in different media. I think also just trying out different tools and not trying to just really figure out how to use a nib pen or something like that. Like, I'll use it and I'll love the way it feels and think about how that informs the story. Or for like my story, my book, The Lagoon, that was all trying to figure out how to use nib pens and brushes, but it also really matched the story, which is set in this like kind of swampy, dark, moody place.
With this swooping music that runs through it.
You can see like using ink and a nib pen in some of the forms. And I mean, I think it's kind of an evolution too. I don't think I have a range and I'm just choosing per story. It kind of goes through phases based on what I'm looking at.
And what you're experimenting with as materials as well.
Yeah, I think printmaking informs it a lot too, where, for this book, I don't know if there's any slides of it,
I do have some,
it's really ornate, and it's all drawn with a pen, but I was like looking at, woodcuts and folk art and these very patterned, ornate things, and it's, that kind of fed into how I was approaching those very short stories. And then with other things, like this one is kind of stories told visually. And I was doing screen printing then.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask.
And just playing a lot with like flat color and seeing how they overlaps and really like telling stories through the use of color and imagery mainly. So I just feel like it is informed by what I'm looking at and what I'm excited about, trying to learn.
And yet, for all the big changes visually that you're experimenting with different ways of visual storytelling, there's a remarkable consistency to your voice as a writer. That is, I feel like I began to realize that the thing I recognize as being kind of, that I can kind of see, okay, that's Lilli Carré. Now let's see how she's using it with a different approach to visual storytelling, is your voice as a writer. You have this kind of you have this kind of wonderful way of bringing together the kind of routines and everyday rituals of life in what we would call the real world that we live in and sometimes feel like we're kind of mechanically bound to. And then these moments, and so many of your stories, whether it's your books for young readers or your even most experimental work, these kind of alternative spaces or realities or dream spaces that kind of collide or interweave with them. I was wondering if you have any kind of thoughts, like what is it about that particular theme of night spaces and dream spaces and the ways they interact with our everyday world that interests you as a writer?
Yeah. That's one of those things that after I wrote a certain number of stories, I just sort of realized, well, this keeps popping up. What's this about? And I think that, one of the things I've seen a lot in comics and just like thought a lot about through animation and comics is this idea of cartoon logic, that there's this kind of otherworldly space that is really a reflection of the character's world. It's not really the real world, It's this other space where you can't die, where you can squash and stretch and, you endure all this stuff, but it has its own kind of forgiving and like very dark logic at the same time. And so I kind of like the idea of pitting that against the actual experience of someone, that you could kind of be inhabiting these two different ways of approaching life.
That's beautiful.
Your experience of it.
There's one story, I actually put the whole one up, and I don't know, particularly for those who are closer can probably read it better, but this story got a lot of, where was it published originally? Was it in Moan?
I wrote this one actually just for Heads or Tails.
It was just for Heads or Tails, okay. And and it was, I think maybe, I don't know, I don't even want to say it's my favorite because I love so many stories, but it's one of the most exquisitely crafted stories in the book, formally, and it also is about people whose kind of everyday lives and rituals are interrupted by something. Often they can't figure out what it is that puts them into a place that they are out of their usual rituals. They're in this in-between space. And it's just also wonderful in its use of color. And I wonder if you could maybe just, I'll play page turner for you, but if you could talk a little bit about the kind of nesting and structures of this story and how you put it together.
Sure. Yeah, this was a story that I wrote after I'd compiled all the stuff I wanted to put into Heads or Tails and looked at all the work I'd been doing, over 5 years. And I was seeing this theme of all these characters just being really caught in between two different paths and being sort of caught in the state of indecision or in-betweens, and both formally and also as part of the story. So it's something I was really thinking about and being like, why is this a thing in my stories? And I was just thinking of my own kind of experiences. And there's this expression, I don't know if anyone else says this or my parents just made it up, but they said like, when I was, if I was crying and laughing at the same time, they were like, oh, you're having a rainbow moment. Of just like kind of feeling everything all at once, like all the colors. And so it's this term in my head that I kind of use or like think about for just being totally caught in between two emotions or like two states where you don't have any idea what you're feeling, I guess.
Yeah.
And so
and you wait to see what the feeling means, right? So that's you have
right.
It begins with a description of his partner's rainbow moment, where he comes home and finds her upside down, laughing, crying, her face changing, and he doesn't know what she's feeling, and she doesn't really know what she's feeling, and a series of stories start going on.
Yeah, I was thinking about the idea of like a rainbow moment of actually depicting something that could like compress all these different moments of different people that are kind of stuck in some kind of in-between state, but then also the idea of making them in someone else's story.
Right.
And I really love Calvino and his If on a Winter's Night, a traveler book, was very inspirational to this kind of structure where someone's telling a story and then the person in their story starts telling a story and then, it's nested like that. But I thought that color would be a way of doing that without saying like, and then the character said. It was just something you could do only in comics without actually like stating that someone was within another story. You could just kind of switch to this other color and you'd feel like you're in the space of another story. Kind of like in a movie when they have like a kind of a halo effect or something, you can tell you're like in another space.
And you can actually, even for those of you guys, we don't have a big screen to play with today, but you can see when one person's story then becomes the nested story, then the nested story starts telling a story, and we move into this kind of olive and ochre.
I think normally it's yellow, but
I apologize for my transfer through the screen, and so on until, and this is the rainbow moment in some sense, right? Is when they all kind of have a chance to articulate. They start telling one story together. I love that. I mean, and I confess I didn't get that was the rainbow. I mean, the rainbow moment.
That's just my own. That's kind of my motivation for structuring it that way and thinking about it.
But it's as if they can't have their true rainbow moment, that is the articulation of what it means, until somehow in this cartoon logic, as you put it, they're all able to narrate the story simultaneously, collapsing across time and space, right? So you get all the colors at once coming together, and spaces that should be geographically separate by not just physical space, but temporal space, are actually kind of collapsed into this rainbow. Oh, that's awesome. And so the color was not just then about a way of telling different stories within stories and making it clear to the reader, but also then becomes a metaphor for what the rainbow moment might look like.
Mm-hmm. But that didn't need to come across. That was just kind of my own sort of structure and thinking behind.
Let's go back to those rainbow moments themselves, because I've been having a lot of them lately, where I'm not sure if I'm laughing or crying. Are those moments then, as this story seems to suggest, where we kind of need other people's stories to get at what they mean? That it's not just about, often those are moments where we're really in our own head, right? We're really like, what am I feeling? What's going on with me? But this story seems to suggest, ultimately, there's a need to tell stories and listen to other people's stories to get at what they mean. Maybe
You
I'm
could
getting
say
too
that.
self-help
I like
guidey
that.
now, but I like to turn these into counseling sessions for me if we can, as long as I'm here. All right, well, I'm going to think. I like that. I'm going with that. Thank you. You've solved my problem. No, I honestly, the stories there, they're all exquisitely crafted, but now that you tell me that that story was written just for here, it makes sense why it feels in some ways like it's a key that unlocks other things in the book as a whole. It's a beautiful book. I could spend all day just talking about that book, but I also want to talk about some of your other works, including Lagoon, which was kind of hailed at the time it came out as your first graphic novel, which, because we have to use the word graphic novel in marketing.
It's a confusing term.
It's a confusing term, and one, for you, one of the things I love about you is that in some ways, even a longer work like The Lagoon, which in some sense takes place within a shared kind of narrative universe, it's also about stories within stories, kind of a passing on of stories. There's a way in which it almost feels like nested, or not nested so much as interwoven stories within this swampy space of the lagoon. And you said a little bit earlier about, this was 2008?
Yeah.
You said a little bit about here you're working with nib and brush, and really letting yourself have a more inky, kind of swampy feel to it. And one of the things I love about this comic, I'm obsessed for some reason as a comics reader with the fact that cartoonists, and particularly kind of arts cartoonists like yourself who are interested in multiple media, have a fascination with music. And you said you began thinking you might want to work with sound and music, and do so in some of your animation, of course, but comics are the one thing they don't naturally do easily is sound and music, right? They can do lots of things, text, image, symbol, but they don't have a soundtrack. And yet, some of the most wonderful comics, including this one, are about sound and representing sound. So I have to ask you a question I've always wanted to ask a cartoonist. What possesses you to try and write a comic about music and sound?
It's a good question. I think one thing I like about trying different things is that it's a constraint to really push up against. And so that's just kind of my own sort of motivation for something like that. But also, I think when you read a comic, you have a total rhythm in your head. It's this one form where you're looking at images, but you're determining the pace at which you bounce from panel to panel and how much time you kind of spend on each chunk. And I can have no control over how someone reads it other than to kind of think about that myself as I'm writing it and try and pace things in this very particular way and think about, in an image like that, you don't hear the actual notes. Like, I have no intention of having people know what song that might be or what it sounds like, but I do want it to feel immersive, and I want it to have the rhythm, in some way kind of control the rhythm of how someone flows through it.
And I feel like I do know what it sounds like, that song. It's disturbing, but I understand being drawn to it. So the kind of central motif, or kind of the book starts with a grandfather kind of telling about how the swamp there used to be a song that would come from the swamp, from a creature in the swamp. Hasn't been heard a lot of late, and then suddenly it starts to be heard again and has different effects on people in this family, and the neighbors around too, since other people seem to end up in the swamp too by the end. And it really is about how people are responding differently to this song, which we can't hear, but somehow we do end up hearing with our eyes and with the rhythm of the pages here. And I like what you said about comics having a rhythm. I think that is part of what attracts cartoonists to music, is that you are composing. Like poetry, like music, you are thinking about kind of rhythm and patterns and motifs, the kinds of things that maybe a novelist doesn't think about in the same way.
And you're thinking about composition too, and there's this real visual harmony that you're always trying to get. And so I just think it's kind of a natural jump.
Yeah, no, and it really works just beautifully in this work, which is ends with a kind of beautiful kind of fading out that almost feels like the fading out of the music as the fire embers slowly go out. It's a beautiful book. Highly recommend it. But again, this was your second big book that I had seen, and I was like already like, wow, okay, she's going to be doing something different all the time. Here's another representation of the music, and you do that wonderful thing across multiple panels, weaving across time and space, but weaving a continuous music that can cross those boundaries. And then the next book of yours that I saw, this was your next big book, right? 2009 or so.
Yeah.
You did 9 Ways to Disappear, which is what we were just talking about earlier, which has a kind of very strong woodcut feel. I was going to actually ask if you used any wood or lino cut, but you said it's all drawn with pen and ink.
Yeah, I mean, I was doing some printmaking and like lino cut stuff at the same time I was working on this.
Yeah.
And so I was looking at a lot of that stuff, but to actually draw it, I was using microns.
All with microns? Really?
I think
Wow.
so.
Wow.
Maybe some brush pens and stuff.
It's a beautiful book. And you did it with a small press that I didn't know before, Little Otsu, which is out of Oregon, is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
They were in San Francisco and now they're in Portland. But they just asked me if I wanted to do a project with them, and I'd worked with them on some other like paper goods kind of stuff.
Right.
But they were sharing the space with McSweeney's at the time. I think they were inspired to do some publishing and jump into that world. And it just seemed like they were good people, and I wanted to.
Yeah, no, and it gave you a chance to try something you really hadn't done much of, except in 1 or 2 short stories, which is the single panel. So it's a page per panel kind of as it looks here, with 2 facing images. It reminded me of some of the old like Lindward woodcut novels from the 30s, which I think also comes out of that whole Chicago school from back then. And it's a series of stories of various kinds of disappearances. And again, a theme of people whose everyday lives, a lot of sleepwalkers, another motif that runs through, of people whose everyday lives and rituals are suddenly transformed by some event, a new lover, or a kind of bifurcation of the spirit. What made you choose this approach? This is my favorite one. The guy who he has a girlfriend whose eyes are set wide apart, that he can't decide if it's beautiful and lovely that her eyes are apart, or if it's creepy and alien. And eventually it starts to creep him out so much that he decides to hide between her eyes so she can't see him. So there he is hiding for hours, days, weeks at a time between her eyes, and she is distraught because she can't find him there. I love that one. That had a Mad Magazine feel to it. So why a panel per page? It works beautifully, but what made you think of it?
When I did this book, I think I just needed to do something else. After doing the Lagoon and spending 3 years on and off doing that, and thinking so much about, trying to figure out these materials and make them like fluid, and thinking about the page and the composition and the rhythm. I'm like, okay, no more rhythm for a while. I just want one image. And also doing the printmaking stuff, I was just thinking about single images, and this kind of ornate, kind of just letting my hand go sort of nuts. So the borders, I think that just came out of like really looking at a lot of this old printing and like ornate borders and stuff like that, and thinking about comics panels being invisible usually, like you're not supposed to really register them at all.
Right.
And so I guess I just tried to, not for any active reason other than just wanting to try out drawing these things as their own kind of.
And the gutter
printed
here
images.
becomes the space where there is visual information as opposed to this empty space. This is the sleepwalker who has a brief respite from his sleepwalking when he finds a lover who sleeps on top of him and holds him down. Doesn't last, though. I had this other experience reading it where I kept wanting to, and particularly with some of them, where I wanted to kind of flip through them like it was a flip book, that maybe I could make them animate. Were you doing some animation during this period too, or was it primarily a printmaking period?
Oh, I've always been doing animation simultaneously. I feel like animation and comics are the things I go back and forth between, and then maybe I'll try printmaking processes or, recently ceramics,
Right.
different things. But I think in my core, I think animation and comics are the things that I go back to.
And they're closely bound up with each other for you?
Yeah, and I think the way I even approached doing my very first comic, which I don't know if you have any images of, it's called Welcome. It was before What's Been Pete, but it's all drawn without panel borders. It's really just images on a page, kind of like keyframes of an animation.
Here, turn the sound.
This is one of the animations.
Yeah, I just got to put up a little bit of animation. Just
This is one of my first.
this was from 2005, I think.
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah, I think that's what I saw. And we have a head coming off in this one.
Oh, I'm
too.
sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, this is all just drawn on paper and backlit, and shapes are cut out of the bottom piece of paper for each drawing to allow light to shine through it in different ways.
Oh, wow.
But I was, watching a lot of Fleischer cartoons, and again, back to that cartoon logic that's definitely in this piece for sure.
Yeah, and this is, and in the course of the, I'm going to be, although it violates everything in my soul and spirit, I'm just going to jump ahead for a second in the animation, where she's up on the top of this hill confronting the moon, and they're having this kind of face-off, literally a kind of face-off here. And she starts to transform. And one of the effects, she finds this star that will serve a kind of, enters into her own body. Bodies and their transformations, dramatic aging or transmutation, that's something animation does really wonderfully well, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's that in a lot of your, either your moving pictures, your kind of GIFs, a lot of them are about transmuting bodies.
Mm-hmm.
And it's as something that, at that moment of kind of the beginning of animation, animators realized that they could do that, movies couldn't do. They could really play with the human body.
Everything in animation is always in flux. Everything is vibrating, everything is redrawn over and over, and it's just constantly kind of mutating, because that's the natural way the line wants to go if you're drawing it repeatedly, And so it's something that I think definitely shows up. And yeah, she's in this cartoon world, and she's aging, and she doesn't kind of know how to process it. And even when she dies, she's still in this cartoon world. She's kind of still stuck in this strange.
And we feel like we're still within the same one night, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because the dog is.
Well, the dog is older.
He is older. It's true.
Time is
Time
totally
is off, right?
in flux as well.
And then the moon's face itself has changed and transformed. So you're doing this. There's no computer mediation here.
I never really learned how to do that stuff. When I was studying animation, it was mainly just paper, light box.
Right.
Now I can I do some animations drawing with a Wacom,
Right.
just straight into Flash, but in the most basic way. I don't really know how to do fancy stuff.
Well, and one of the effects of that, of course, is you get, as you said, that wavering line, which digital animation, you have to work to get that right.
Yeah, it's kind of funny working backwards to get something that looks more human.
Exactly, yeah. Which is often what we have to do with digital techniques is, let's make it look grainier and like a human hand actually touched it.
Yeah, I definitely do that too.
Right.
But I try to counterbalance it by actually
Doing
making
it.
stuff by hand. I think I just need to be working in different ways.
This is just one more head.
So this one was all drawn with a Wacom.
This was all with the Wacom pad.
Yeah. But I'm totally guilty because I put that paper texture behind it.
No, it's
Add
great.
that little real-world human touch.
Part of what I love about this is just in terms of the early history of animation also is that this is the very first animations in America where almost all of them were kind of chalk drawings of faces that would come alive. And so I feel like you've got that. It's a kind of wonderful homage to that tradition as well. And decapitation is never the end of anything.
Right. Yeah, the character still has to figure out what to do when their head rolls away.
So fear not, if your head comes off, there is hope. What's the longest animation you've done?
Not that long. I think 5 minutes-ish, 6 minutes, something like that.
And can you just tell a little bit? Jeff mentioned the experimental animation festival that you've organized. Is it a national or is it kind of regional?
It's small. I mean, we do it in Chicago. It's my husband and I.
Right. Does he do animation as well?
Yeah.
Oh, cool.
And more like experimental film kind of stuff. And I think, what got us started wanting to do something like that and give a home to a certain kind of animation was that I didn't really see where else it could exist or where people could encounter it without seeking it out. Because it's not really the kind of thing we're interested in. There's like a certain flavor of it that doesn't really fit with regular animation festivals that are more character and narrative driven and a much more like, aha, kind of way, like, it,
Right.
It's swallowable in a certain sense,
Right.
or very slick.
Make me laugh, make me cry, kind of.
Or just like, I don't know, or just like too conventionally narrative, or not too conventionally, but just not this thing that there wasn't really a place for. And then experimental film festivals, animation in that might be something that really sticks out. Like, animations are in that, but it doesn't fit as neatly into that, and there's all this kind of work being made in this space in between these two, places to see that kind of work. So we wanted to create a home for that and just bring older films, like stuff on 16 millimeter that we could show, and then pair that with new work that was being made.
And do you guys, after you do the festival, is there any kind of curating or collection of what you do in a kind of DVD format or some space? I'm just being selfish now. I want to see
Not in that
these
format,
things.
but we do link to the ones that are online.
Okay, good.
And then we also, when we're asked to show it elsewhere, oftentimes we'll take the show, somewhere else. So
Yeah, that might be something we should talk about, bringing you over to Ohio State at some point. And thinking about narrative, I mean, that was the other thing I wanted to ask you about, because this is another book, very slim book you did for an ongoing series that Little Otsu does called Living Things. And this is called Shifting Shadows. This is just from a couple of years ago. And this was, you described it earlier, and here you're doing screen printing. You described it earlier as very short stories, but they're not exactly narrative in a kind of conventional sense. Right?
Yeah, I probably shouldn't have said the word
No,
stories.
please.
I think that... I know, but I don't really think of them as stories.
Yeah, I was going to ask you. It seemed like a moment where you were kind of liberated from narrative to some degree.
I mean, I think these, they have this theme, and they want people to take different approaches to living things in any way.
Right.
And I threw a bunch of different ideas at them, and the one that they responded to was this idea of sort of the secret life of shadows, or this sort of, visual thing that kind of reveals something about the subject in this kind of humorous way. So that became the parameters for myself, and I just made these kind of visual puns in a sense, or I don't know what you'd call them, but just different drawings around the idea of the subject in the shadow and something kind of revealing something about the other one.
Which as we saw, is something that runs throughout all your work in the kind of long-form narratives, as that there is always, this kind of other shadow self that
it's not what is presented, yeah.
Right, that lives in some kind of parallel relationship, which is the story where the selves literally split into two, and the one ends up...
The thing about Madeline?
Yes.
Okay, yeah.
I love that story. So suddenly there's two versions of the same person, and one of them has to move on just because there's not room that we could have a shadow self that has a different life.
And that has a more, maybe more grounded life.
Yeah.
And the original, I guess, character, or one of them, is spying on this other version of herself and being like, how is she doing this?
Yeah.
How is she, doing this in this right way?
And it also, especially that story, but all of them as well, kind of get at that other thing that seems deep in the genome of comic storytelling, which is, and it's part of that cartoon logic and part of the cartoon logic's interest in time, which is this idea of parallel lives or parallel worlds, that they're, that at any moment, even in our everyday lives, there's all these forks. In superhero comics, it plays out with all that multiverse stuff, but we see it in a lot of other comics traditions too, the idea that at any moment our lives could go in other directions. And there's these shadows of lives that we don't live. I see that running through so much of your work, except for poor woodsman Pete, who doesn't.
Oblivious.
He's not going anywhere. He's there and seems pretty happy with
set.
it. Yeah, he seems.
He tells himself that.
I know we're going to run out of time soon, and Jeff's going to start waving at me. So I want to just quickly talk about some of, move away from my comics geekdom just for a second, and talk about some of your other stuff. I don't think we don't have any of this stuff on display here, do we? Your book art stuff. Not here, but it's in Chicago at that gallery. And I wanted to ask you about your book art stuff because that's a tradition that also has a strong connection with comics, but also has some real differences. Book arts, I mean, Hillary Shute, who's at the University of Chicago, she always says about comics, and I love the phrase, she says, comics are always site-specific installations. And you can see that in your books, right? There's very careful thought and design about what's the shape of the paper, what's the right size. But unlike a traditional art installation, they're reproducible. You can print 1,000, 10,000 copies of it. Whereas with the art books that you do, these are kind of built to be artisanal, sometimes one of a kind, I imagine, or certainly not available for long runs. What draws you to the art books?
I think it's what also excited me about comics in the first place was the idea you could make an object, and then you can tell it's handmade, and then someone else can hold it. It's this very intimate thing. It's like an intimate way of communicating. It still uses the book form, but with artist books, there's all these different ways you can tell a narrative through the shape of the book, and playing with the format that's hard to print. It's hard to print a book that looks like a circle, or that even getting a pop-up book made. Yeah. Or this is a hand letterpressed book that I did as I was trying to learn the letterpress. But I was also interested in the accordion format and how a narrative could unfold in that way. And looking at a lot of older printing, and again thinking about the borders, but then using this kind of older technique to create the imagery.
And making books, I mean, I got to see a few of the artist books you have on exhibit currently in Chicago, making books that have a sculptural quality too, that can move in different dimensions than the traditional book can as well. And I think I've noticed that a lot of cartoonists at what we sometimes fear is the final generations of print and the traditional book are kind of interested in thinking about the bookishness of books, the material nature of book. And I mentioned I couldn't find my copy of Lagoon before the interview, and I got on email. I wrote to her publisher, and they emailed me an electronic version, right? But nobody could email me an electronic version of these. I mean, I have one, but it's not the same. There's something that doesn't allow itself for that digital translation that insists on its material oneness. Is that an appeal as well?
What,
the fact that it can't go through digital translation?
I mean, well, it's funny you say that because this one I actually did put in
book, right?
The book as
this
a
one
digital
you did.
kind of.
Let's go to that one. Sorry, better example.
Yes, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think that there's like a certain kind of aura to something that can't exist in any other form. And all the books I make are very sloppy. Like, I'm not very good at pop-up, but I really want to learn how to do that. And I like the constraint of like make an illustration that can collapse in on itself. And you have to work around the forms that you can at least physically make. And so that kind of informs the imagery and the overall object. And I think that, I don't know, I just like working around those physical constraints that can't really be translated to.
And about, it sounds like as you talk also, you like working around the process of learning too, that you actually like working in materials and forms that you're still learning how to work with.
Well, I think it's just kind of thrilling, when you first try out a nib pen or like try making a pop-up and it works, or like you feel how nice it feels to use something new and you're like, oh gosh, I should have been doing this the whole time. Or like, just seeing something you're so familiar with through a different lens in a way. I think that is addictive.
Yeah, I mean, but it's not, of course, as you know, what every cartoonist does, right? I mean, a lot of cartoonists find the technique that works for them, and that's they'll do it for 50 years. So it's for me as a reader, it's exciting to see somebody who's always trying something new, and including, as you mentioned, doing a lot of ceramics work. So this is a central part of the big show in Chicago right now. Is this fairly new for you?
Yeah, it's very new. Well, maybe like a year or so.
Okay,
I've been
wow.
just taking classes. I found a place in Chicago where you can just sign up for classes and then have access and use the kiln and have clay and glazes and stuff. And I just really like the idea of working with something so physical. After, drawing something I feel very comfortable with because I've just been doing it always.
Right.
But clay, there's no starting point. Like, you're not putting a line to paper. There's no, like, even if I have something in mind that I want to make, it never translates because I don't have the dexterity, or I don't have that, like, straight connection that I do with drawing that I, with something physical
Right.
and messy and, like, awkward. And so that's what I really like about working with it, is it's just so different, but I can still attempt to make something and know that it's not going to turn out like I intended at all. And so there's like the physical relationship to making the object, and then the glazes is a whole other world of like glaze
Yes.
chemistry and combinations, and it's really hard to know.
I think I had some nice pictures early on. I'm trying to find them of some of your.
Well,
There we go. That
okay.
one is it doesn't necessarily come through very well.
But at least you can see the kind of shapes that I'm
The
making.
shapes, yeah, the hands drooping over the edge there.
And I'm still trying to get a sense of character, like translate how I draw into clay, but I kind of like how difficult that is. And also drawing on them with underglaze pencil and trying to translate mark making to something that's so awkward. But then, so often they come out totally different, just the form, but also the glazes, and then in the kiln.
The kiln is a magical
It's
space,
just
right?
like
where
nobody
my
knows.
father's a potter, and,
Oh,
and
it's so
he has a big 4-story wood kiln. He stays up till for 4 days straight firing it, and when he talks about it, he gets all new agey, and he says, one of the wonderful things is you put it in with all your plans, and what comes out has nothing to do with your plans. It's like the kiln laughs at your plans, and something, it's alchemy. It really is alchemy, right? So what comes out is, so I mean, for you, it seems like that part of the pleasure then is that kind of not being totally in control.
Yeah, or being completely out of control. Yeah, that's what I really
I
like
love
about
that, though. I mean, because I often feel, and I know this is, Jeff is recording this, so I hope none of my cartoonist friends who share my love and affliction with OCD will hear this and think I'm saying anything mean about them, because I'm with them in many respects. But a lot of cartoonists like cartooning because it is about a place where you can control space within the panels. It's about a place where the world can be ordered. And within the limits of that universe, that page, there is something that I think for many cartoonists talk about this at some length. It is a place where as chaotic as the world is outside, here I can have some sense of order and control. And for you, part of what I love about your work and love talking to you about it today is the sense of spontaneous discovery, of going into, beginning a story, not sure which style you're going to trying a new pen, and instead of practicing for a year until you figure it out, actually letting the practice be part of the discovery of the story itself. And then going to a totally new art form, and in which even more things out of your control are going to happen. It brings to the comics page something that's not always found in contemporary comics, which is that sense of dreamlike spontaneity and kind of deep faith that the night parade will take us somewhere special. And I really like that. Actually, I have to make a plug for that book just quickly that Jeff mentioned as a freebie or a prize for those who fill in the survey. It came out very recently. I think this is your most recent thing. Is that right? Is a Tippy and the Night Parade from Toon Books, which was set up by Art Spiegelman and Francois Mouly as in terms of their larger interest in literacy for young readers through comics. And it's a gorgeous book. And it's also a great series of books if you're looking for getting your young folks hooked on good comics early. This is a great series. Did they approach you about doing this project, or?
Yeah, and I had to sort of quickly think of different ideas to propose, and also think about how a kid would interpret a story and what they, understand. And I'm not really around kids all that much, so I couldn't really test the story ideas on anyone. And so that was another constraint, was just being like, okay,
am I going to damage children?
do kids understand sleepwalking?
Yeah.
Or certain things you never really think about.
And are they going to be freaked out by this sleepwalking girl with all these wild animals following her?
Yeah,
through the
like
woods?
what's creepy or what's okay and what's exciting, and does it make sense that at one point you have to flip the book on its side? Is that exciting
Kids
or is
get
that
I mean,
confusing?
yeah, no, it's and I think honestly, I often feel like the best writers for young kids are the ones who aren't second guessing themselves when test marketing their ideas to actual real kids, and allowing the kind of darkness and creepiness to also come into it, because that's the world kids live in. They live in a world of dreams, but also nightmares and dark spaces that are much more alive for them than they are for many of us, because we work hard to repress them. And it works. It's beautiful. It's a wonderful thing. I know we're gonna take some time and walk over to the gallery so folks can talk with you. But I wanted to just kind of, where's Jeff? Is it okay if do we have a few minutes to see if there are any questions from the?
Yeah, actually, I think.
Or save questions for.
Right now is a great time for us to just move over to the gallery.
Okay, and then let people talk with.
Snacks.
Oh, snacks are good. Okay, great. Because
I just wanted to mention that Lilli's agreed to sign books if you have them, or also in the store upstairs we have Tippy, and then also 9 Ways to Disappear available in the store, and then also there's just a selection of Lilli's books in the gallery so you can browse through and take a look at some of the printed works, because it is a different experience when you've got the thing in your hand.
yeah, and they're each different. They feel different.
But I mean, thanks a lot, guys.
Thank you.
Great.
Oh, thank
And
you.
then